Hopes of a ceasefire in the civil war in Libya have been dampened by a blockade on the country's main ports that was enforced by the renegade warlord General Khalifa Haftar. His forces halted most oil exports yesterday, 2 days before a summit in Berlin on the conflict in Libya. This will be attended by all the key players, including the Russian and Turkish presidents who back rival sides. Turkey supports the United Nations-backed government of Fayez al-Sarraj, and Moscow has been assisting General Haftar. The UN's envoy to Libya, Hassan Salameh, has called on foreign powers to stop backing proxies in the war. We now cross live to Ira Spitzer for more. A very good morning to you, Ira. Tell us about the meeting. Who's expected to attend?
Well, there's clearly a lot at stake at this meeting in Berlin, and you can see that from the list of attendees. We are expecting Russian President Vladimir Putin, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leaders of both sides in the Libyan conflict, General Khalifa Haftar, as well as the UN-backed government. In addition, of course, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron will be here, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We'll also have the African Union chairperson Moussa Faki here as well. So a lot at stake, of course, with this very fragile ceasefire, which actually hasn't even been agreed after General Haftar left talks in Moscow earlier in the week without signing that agreement. So there are hopes to move this peace process forward today here in Berlin to prevent more bloodshed in Libya. There are certainly concerns that the situation there, which already has been horrible, but could become even worse given the recent escalation of violence and involvement from foreign powers now in Libya, especially with Turkey and Russia becoming more and more involved there.
I'm listening to the list of global leaders that you say will be attending. And last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa here at home was saying that as the incoming chair of the African Union, he was saying that the Libya question is an African problem that must be resolved by African, and was firm that Africa must take the lead. Is Africa properly represented in this meeting?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly the focus has been on Russia and Turkey specifically. So there certainly could be the case to be made that this is not being treated as an African problem, but be that as it may, the countries that are sending weapons or troops, in the case of Turkey, to Libya, they certainly at this point are driving the agenda, I would say. So of course those leaders and those countries have perhaps an outsized impact on the problem. So despite, of course, those calls for this to be resolved in an African context, it does seem that considering the tremendous interest to Europe and elsewhere of what's happening in Libya, this has now become a global problem. So we'll see what sort of solutions, if any, come out of the meeting today. I don't think hopes are especially high for any sort of major breakthrough, but just the fact that the leaders of the two factions are going to, we expect, be in the same room and talking about the ceasefire, perhaps even agreeing to a ceasefire today, that could be somewhat of a major step. But when you look at this oil embargo and the things happening on the ground, it seems that peace and a ceasefire is really not that imminent based on what we know right now.
Russia has its own current political problems, what with the resignation of cabinet this week. How much can it give emphasis to other problems, including problems in Libya?
Well, I think the Russian government, it is, of course, undergoing this transformation. President Vladimir Putin is still very much in control of Russia and will continue to be so for some time. So this is a priority for him specifically and for the Russian government, despite whatever problems they may have. But yes, it is true that Russia has seen just has a lot happening at this exact moment. So just from an organizational perspective, it does seem hard to imagine that they could be able to perhaps put the full weight that is required to get somewhere in this Libyan conflict. But this has been a huge priority. We saw Chancellor Angela Merkel in Moscow just a week ago. Of course, talks between Russia and Turkey taking place earlier this week. So this is very much the priority right now for the Russian government, it seems.
Ira, let's talk about the prospects of the Berlin meetings. The two factions failed to reach an agreement, as you say, in Moscow last week. Are we likely to see any lasting solution coming out of this particular meeting?
Well, I can't say with any sort of certainty there. That would be the hope, of course, is that there is some real progress made today in Berlin. The German government seems to be trying to dampen expectations a bit, at least in their press briefing on Friday. But the two goals here today, as we understand them, are to try and sign that ceasefire agreement that was not signed earlier in the week in Moscow, and as well to try and reinstate the UN-backed the UN arms embargo to Libya, which has been much violated. Of course, we've seen support from the outside, countries like the United Arab Emirates supporting the Khalifa Haftar's rebellion there. So they would like to try and reinstate that arms embargo if possible, and put some sort of ceasefire into effect at the meeting today.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Ira. As we conclude our conversation, just remind us of the strategic importance of Libya to the global system.
Right. Well, Libya's location at the tip of North Africa, with its long Mediterranean coastline, with its access to oil and gas resources, for those reasons, in particular, it has tremendous global importance. And with the destabilization of Libya, we've also seen a ripple effect in the rest of Africa, certainly in the Sahel states. The flow of arms and fighters and whatnot as a result of the chaos in Libya has been destabilizing for neighboring countries. And as I mentioned, the oil and gas resources, tremendously important. In fact, Turkey's interest in Libya, one of the major interests is they just signed an agreement in December for oil and gas exploration with the current Libyan government. So if the rebels led by Khalifa Haftar were to take over the government, that would probably make that agreement invalid. So natural resources, strategic position, Libya is an extremely important country for many places in the world.
Where exactly in Berlin is the meeting taking place, and what are the times?
The meeting will take place in the building behind me here. That is Chancellor Angela Merkel's office, the Chancellery, and the arrivals of the leaders, the world leaders who are coming here, is expected to take place in about 4 or 5 hours from now. So they will arrive here, be greeted by Chancellor Merkel, and then we'll go inside for the meetings to begin. They will likely last all day, so we won't have much resolution for perhaps another 12 hours now.
Ira, thank you so much for setting the scene for us.
Ghassan Salame says the Berlin summit scheduled for Sunday would likely discuss the closures of oil ports to avoid them dragging on for weeks or months like previous seizures of facilities.
If the thing is not solved between today and tomorrow, I expect the issue to be raised, yes. Now I can't compel any head of state to raise this rather than that issue, but I won't be surprised that a few participants raise the necessity of keeping the neutrality of the national oil company in place.
Oil export terminals across eastern and central Libya were shut on Friday by tribesmen allied to Commander Khalifa Haftar. Haftar's Libyan National Army, the LNA, based in the east, has been locked in a 9-month war with government forces over the control of the capital, Tripoli. Diplomats see the closures as a power play by the LNA aimed at choking off oil revenue to the internationally recognized Tripoli government. The National Oil Corp says the closures would result in the loss of 800,000 barrels per day in oil output. Production in Libya, which has plunged into chaos with the toppling of longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, was estimated at 1.3 million barrels per day last week. Salami says he hopes Haftar will be willing to consider extending a truce, which is largely held for a week, despite the two sides failing to sign a deal at talks in Moscow, mediated by Russia and Turkey on Monday.
And that's why we have this Berlin conference, to tell Mr. Haftar and to tell others that the international community, it is true that many countries have been supporting the war on this side or on the other side, but the international community has come to the conclusion, I hope, that they are taking a big risk by fueling this war.
Haftar is expected to attend the Moscow summit opposite Tripoli-based Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj. The war over Tripoli is backed by foreign powers, with the LNA supported by the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and most recently Russian mercenaries, and Turkey sending troops and fighters from Syria's civil war to help al-Sarraj.
You certainly have people who are there for ideological reasons. You have also experts helping with drones and things like that. They have different legal status, but the number of non-Libyans participating in the war has been on the increase, and this is certainly not a good sign.
And how many of these Syrians do you think are there? Some people say
I can't give you a figure because the UN doesn't have an intelligence service, but it's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000.
There have been a series of failed conferences and negotiations to stabilize Libya.
To London now, where